Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today's video is part of the Trinity Stamps Turns 1 blog hop. We are celebrating a big, huge release. Today I am going to be using the Mermaid Wishes and Ocean Reef Builder stamp set, as well as the Narrow Card and Bookmark with envelope die set. That's a mouthful, but you can see why. It comes with a ton of things. It has the envelope builder, it has some word dies there, it has some embellishments, the bookmark, as well as your card panel. So here are the main pieces that we'll be using today to create the card as well as the envelope. So this piece here will be the front portion of the envelope, and I am just taking some post-it note tape here to mask off the little flaps of the envelope because I want to keep those white. You don't necessarily need to do this, but I wanted to kind of differentiate between what is what when I decorate my little envelope. I am going to go ahead and use the Ocean Reef Builder stamp set just to create a little bit of a scene on my envelope, but still leave plenty of room to address it or to write on it to whoever this is going to go to. So I'm going to be using my Misty here and just line up just a few of the little elements from the Ocean Reef Builder stamp set. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp this with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. I did stamp this twice. My ink pad is starting to go dry and I have yet to buy a refill. So I've been using my Misty a lot more lately because I know I have to double stamp pretty much everything. So I went ahead and stamped that out, and I'm going to mask these images out, but they are teeny tiny. So instead of using masking paper, I'm going to be using some liquid Frisket, and I'm just going to kind of twirl this around instead of shaking it just to avoid some air bubbles. And I'm taking a very inexpensive paintbrush. These are the paintbrushes that you get for like $5 for $1 or something like that at the craft store, and I pretty much use it just for this. And I'm just basically going to paint over the images. I'm sort of kind of being careful not to go over the outline, but I know that it's pretty much unavoidable because these images are so teeny tiny. But I'm just basically painting that on, and immediately after, I'm going to clean off my paintbrush. Even though it is a cheapy paintbrush, it does dry pretty quickly and it will kind of get all sticky and cakey on the paintbrush. So for my card panel, again, going to bring out my Misty and bringing out the little mermaid as well as this rock and lining that up on the bottom of my card panel here. And again, stamping this with the Blackout ink twice due to my dry ink pad. And this time I'm just going to be using some Simon Says stamp masking paper to mask these images out, being these are a lot larger and they're a lot easier to cut masks with. And if I didn't already mention it, I cut everything out from Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock for both the envelope as well as the card panel itself. So once I had my images masked out, I am also going to mask out the outer edge of this card panel where the scallop meets the little stitched line. And I'm just taking some washi tape to do this. You can use post-it note tape. You can pretty much use whatever you want. And again, this is optional. I just like to have a white border or a white outline around my ink blended card panel. So I'm going to be working on a piece of scrap paper here, and I'm going to do some ink blending both on the envelope as well as the card panel. I'm going to be using some antique linen, tumbled glass, chip sapphire, and stormy sky, all distress oxide inks. So for my card panel, I'm going to add a little bit of the antique linen on the bottom. This would basically be where the sand is. Then I'm going to add my tumbled glass coming from the top portion of my card panel down, because the lightest area of the water would be towards the top. Then I'm going to go in with that chipped sapphire right on the bottom where the sand meets the water. Blend that out a little bit with the stormy sky, and then again back to that tumbled glass. You can see that the mask where her hair is kind of flipped up a little bit started to come up. Once this happens, there's really no way to completely fix it, but before we start our coloring, I'll show you how at least to cover it up. So I'm kind of just working in the direction of the way the mask is coming up so that it doesn't peel off anymore. Gonna add a little bit more of that antique linen towards the bottom just to kind of bring out that sandy area a little bit more. And for the envelope, I'm gonna skip the sand for this one, and I'm just gonna be using the 3 blues, pretty much going in the same order as I did for the card panel, the chipped sapphire on the bottom, because this would be the darkest area of the water, blending that out with the stormy sky and then the tumbled glass on the top. I am using one of the Trinity stamps blending brushes here, which have been discontinued, but they are coming out with more, so stay tuned for that. They'll be a little bit different, in fact a little bit improved, I should say, so keep an eye out for that in the coming weeks or coming months. So they should be released fairly soon. So once I was happy with the blend that I got with these blues, and you could see that my paper is really, really saturated, I added a ton of ink because I wanted this to be a really, really rich color. I'm going to bring back out my card panel here, and I am going to spatter on some clean water onto both of my panels and dab that up with a paintbrush, or not a paintbrush. You don't dab it up with a paintbrush, you dab it up with a paper towel. And then I'm going to take some shimmer spray and make sure that this is shook up really, really well. All of the good sparkly stuff settles to the bottom. So you want to make sure that it's really shaken up good. Using the little nozzle to sprinkle that onto both of the card panel and the envelope, and then again dabbing that up with a paper towel. I let my panels dry for about 10 or 15 minutes before moving on to the next step, because the oxides kind of lay on top of the paper. Plus I'm adding more moisture with the water and the shimmer spray. I want to make sure that everything is completely dry before moving on to removing the masks and the coloring. So once my panels were dry, I'm going to very, very carefully remove my masks. I'm starting off with the washi tape, and you can see that I'm moving pretty slow. This is sped up just a little bit. Being careful not to tear my paper. Even though I did let this sit, Distress oxides, like I said, take forever to dry. So sometimes that moisture that we used from the water and the shimmer spray, as well as the Distress oxide inks, they kind of seep through your masks. So sometimes when you tear them up, they can tear your paper along with it. So you just want to be super careful. For the masking paper, I just used the tip of my scissors to get that started and peel that off with my fingers. For the liquid frisket, you can just rub your finger right over it and that will peel right up. So once all of my masks were removed, I'm going to take a paintbrush with just a little teeny tiny bit of water and go over that portion of her hair that started peeling up. Let that sit for just a second, dab that up with a paper towel, and it lightened it. It didn't completely take it away, but it at least lightened it where I can cover over it and you won't see through. So moving on to the Copic coloring, I am going to start off with my skin tones. Like always, starting off with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas, then going in with the darkest color to midtones, and then back to that lightest color. The shading for her skin would be underneath where her bangs are hanging over her face, a little bit on either side of her face, underneath her chin, and on the inside of her little arms. On her belly, her little bathing suit top there would cast a little bit of a shadow and also have a little bit of shading on either side, and just keeping a center highlight, just working on a center light source here, not really too concerned about the shading being absolutely perfect here. Once I go back in with my lightest color here, I will bring out my R20 just to add just a little bit of color to her cheeks. And then while the little bit of water that we added to the tips of her hair there dries, because you want to make sure that's completely dry before moving on to the Copic coloring, I'm going to move on to this little rock, and I'm going to use some cool grays for this, going directly in with my darkest color, because I find that the cool grays as well as the warm grays, they blend really well, and I don't necessarily feel the need to totally saturate the paper. I can start with my darkest color, especially being I'm pretty confident where my shading should be. I am creating a shadow where one little rock is in front of another. And on that larger rock in the center, I'm just working again on a center highlight. Not only would this be more of a rounder object, but we are concentrated on a center highlight anyway for the entire card. So once that was complete, we are going to move on to her hair. And of course, I want her to have red hair, just like everybody's favorite mermaid. And for hair, I typically go in directly with my darkest color first, and that way I can kind of preserve some of my flick lines, and this will allow me to keep some of the texture within her hair. So you can see I'm just using the very tip of my marker. This isn't a huge image, so I want to make sure that I'm able to get all 4 of my shades here to make sure that I have some variation in her hair. I am concentrating the shading where her hair would be parted, as well as her little bangs there. I am also adding a little bit of shading on the tips of her bangs just to kind of let those stand out from the rest of her hair. Kind of adding some random shadows and highlights, and this will give you the movement that you're looking for in her hair. She looks like she's got a little bit of a wave to her hair. Just extending those flicks with the very tip of my marker with the darkest mid-tone, and this is a pretty dark red here. The real dark color is a scary dark color, and I know that we had a video maybe about a month and a half ago with the Coloring with Courtney series where we talked about using the scary dark colors to get that contrast. So that includes your hair, or not your hair, but the hair that you're coloring. You want to make sure that you use a scary dark color, and you will get the contrast and the shine that you're looking for when you're coloring hair. So finishing off with the R22 for the highlight areas, and then we'll move on to her little mermaid tail or fin. And I wanted to have a couple of different colors within her tail here. So I'm starting off with a YG01, which is a really, really light yellow green. And I'm just picking out my very darkest areas, basically where my greens will end is where I'm putting the YG01. Going in with my darkest green, and I'm just adding a teeny tiny bit of this off to the left-hand side and where the tail meets the fin, I guess, maybe. Well, whatever, the tip of it. Blending that out a little bit with the YG03 and then back to that YG01 and extending that almost to the edge. Then I'm going to bring out some yellows because I want this to kind of fade from yellow or from green to yellow to kind of an orangish color. So I'm bringing out my Y04 and then the Y35, which is a little bit more orangey than yellow, and I'm just using this sparingly. Then you'll see that I'm going to go in reverse because I want these colors to kind of mesh together, and let's face it, orange and green don't go together. So I use that Y04 as kind of a buffer between the two. And then once you are happy with the blending, stop, because you run the risk of your colors bleeding if you add too much ink to the area. So once I was happy with her little fin and tail there, we're going to move on to her little top. I'm going to bring out some RV markers, starting off with the lightest color to get the paper saturated, just adding a little bit of shading to either side and in the center, blending that out each time with the mid-tone colors, and then going back to that RV11 just for the highlight area. Then for the sandy area here, I wanted to add a little bit of texture here. So I'm going to bring out my E37 and my E35, and I'm just using the very tip of the marker just to add little dots. And I'm kind of just adding these randomly. There's really no rhyme or reason, but this will add a little bit of texture to the sandy area. Being we have all of those spatters in the water area, I wanted to add a little bit of something to the sand. So next we're going to go ahead and put this panel aside, and we're going to move on to the front of the envelope. And for these teeny tiny areas, I'm going to go right in with my darkest color because these areas are so small. You really don't have to do much shading when your images are this tiny, but I kind of kept with the theme and did a little bit of shading to this little seaweed, I guess it is. Just adding that YG01 to the tips to add a little variation in color. For this little coral thing here, I'm going to bring out my R35 and my R32, which the R35 I think is called coral. And again, just going in with my darkest color first for these areas, being these are so teeny tiny, and I didn't do a great job masking here. I kind of went over, I kind of went beyond the image itself in many of the areas. So I'm not really worried about having shading in the right places. I just want a little variation in the color. Nobody's going to really look at it close enough to figure out whether you put your shadows and highlights in the correct area. So I'm not being overly concerned about that. And the black outline that we have of the images that we kind of went over with those distress oxides, which are opaque and will take away those black lines or at least fade them significantly. We'll fix those after all of the coloring is done. You can see I didn't do a great job masking this little starfish either, and I have a big blue blob right in the center from the distress oxide ink, so I must have had a little area that was not masked. So I did the same thing with the paintbrush there, added a little bit of water, dabbed that up with a paper towel. This sat for a little bit too long and I wasn't able to even fade this a little bit, but I've made it this far. I'm not going to start over. For this little clownfish, going to add the little orange stripes, again going in with the darkest color first because these areas are really teeny tiny. I did use a 3-color blend in these areas, but honestly, you don't need to. You could probably just go in with just 1 color and still get great results. For the little white stripes, I did want to add just a little bit of shading, so I brought in my C3 and my C1 just to add a little bit of a shadow and leaving the top portion of the little white stripes white. So I kind of faded from the C1 to white. For the starfish, I'm going to bring out some more YR markers. Again, just going in with my lightest color first. I wasn't able to cover that blue blob at all. In fact, it didn't even fade. You can clearly see it, but it is what it is. So once all of my coloring was done, we are going to go ahead and outline all of the images. I'm taking an EK Success journaling pen, which is a Copic safe pen, and carefully outlining all of the images on the envelope panel. If you have the images still in your MISTI, you can just restamp them. That's probably the easiest way, but I had removed these images. For the mermaid, I didn't. I left them in my MISTI. That way, all I have to do is line that panel back up and restamp everything. I don't have to worry about outlining it. So next, we're going to go ahead and assemble everything together. So for the card panel here, I am taking a piece of black cardstock here, treating that with my anti-static tool, and then go ahead and stamp one of the sentiments from the Mermaid Wishes stamp set with some embossing ink, sprinkling on some white embossing powder, and then heat setting that with my heat tool. I'm taking the little banner die from that same die set, lining that up over my sentiment, sticking down some Post-it note tape so it doesn't shift around in my MISTI, and running that through my, not MISTI, Gemini, and running that through. I have my card base here, and this is a 6x6 piece of cardstock scored at 3 inches. So this is a good way to use up some of your 6x6 papers too. Going to use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere my card panel flat down to my card base. And for my sentiment, I have cut out the Hello sentiment from the Hello Sentiment stamp set or die set that was part of the last release. I cut out the word as well as the outline, and I'm just using my wet glue here to adhere those two together. You can use double-sided adhesive here or like a stick-it, or run it through one of those sticker machines or whatever they're called. But I find that the wet glue works best for me because, as you can see, I struggle to line this up a lot, especially when I don't put glue everywhere it needs to be. So this gives me a couple extra seconds to make sure that everything is lined up before it becomes permanent. Once that is lined up, I'm going to go ahead and adhere this entire word down onto my card panel itself, and then pop up my little sentiment strip or my sentiment banner with some Scotch foam tape directly above my word die. So that is the card. Now we'll move on to the assembly of the envelope, which is very, very easy. So we had die cut 2 of those side pieces, plus we have the front panel that we decorated there. So these, I don't know whether you can see on camera, but they do have score lines that are part of the die. So you don't have to worry about measuring. I'm just using my bone folder here to make sure that my score lines are nice and creased on both the little side panels there, as well as the 2 little flaps on the envelope itself. Here I'm kind of just lining everything up, deciding how they go, because quite honestly, this is the first time I'm putting this together, but it's super easy to do. So I am going to go ahead and use wet glue once again, but you can use like a score tape here, which I know a lot of people prefer, but once again, I don't line things up perfectly the first time, so I find that the wet glue works best for me. So once everything was scored, I'm going to add a little bit of the adhesive to the outside of that little flap. So if it was still laying flat, it would be on the same side of where it's scored, if that makes any sense. And I'm just going to glue that to the outer edge of the inside of the envelope, making sure that I have a couple of seconds to kind of wiggle it around to where it needs to be. And luckily the Tombow Mono Multi Glue dries pretty quickly and becomes permanent pretty quickly. So I'm going to add a little bit of adhesive in the center for these 2 little flaps to meet, as well as the bottom, leaving that top flap open so obviously I can put my card in there. So that is it. That is the card and the envelope for today, guys. More information can be found below for the blog hop, as well as a link to the Trinity store. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.